Thank you so much, David Hoffman, for joining us here at Cuban Studies for a conversation about your new book, Give Me Liberty. We will be discussing that in just a moment, but I want to introduce you to those of you who may not be familiar with his work. David Hoffman has been with the Washington Post since 1982 and has been a contributing editor since 2009. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of several books, but in particular won the Pulitzer Prize for The Dead Hand, which is the untold story of the Cold War arms race and its dangerous legacy. You have also authored a book called The $1 Billion Spy, and my favorite, The Oligarch, Wealth and Power in New Russia. Now, I want to say that it is an honor to have you here. I also am thrilled to have read and been one of probably the first people to have read Give Me Liberty. This is a book that is a unique contribution to the study of Cuba, but also to human rights, to the study of totalitarianism. In so many different ways, it is a unique and phenomenal and very necessary work. So I want to get to that and ask you about Oswaldo Payá, who is the subject of the book. He, in so many ways, was exceptional as a human rights opponent of the Castro government. Probably, I would say, as a historian, that ever since the Cuban government became a communist state around 1960 to 1961, there were so many ways in which people fought the regime, and yet Oswaldo Payá remains a very unique opponent of it. And because he was different, as you argue in the book, he was also uniquely threatening to the Cuban state. So I wonder if you could explain how those two things were the case, how he was unique as an opponent of the Castro regime, and also what made him so threatening, what made his project or his fight so particularly threatening.
Lillian, also I must say, I stand on the shoulders of giants, and your work, especially Visions, which is one of my favorite books about Cuba, just opened my eyes so much, excuse me, to that period of the revolution. So I couldn't have done it without you, not to mention all of your encouragement and help. And I think, these kinds of works, they tend to be collective efforts, right? One author puts his name on it, but I count you among the people that inspired me and really in your own work were a model. Oswaldo Payá was different in a couple of ways that just fascinated me and still do. And one of them was I've always been sort of really interested in what does it take to go up against the system? Well, how does one man summon the courage and the stamina and the faith to do that? And, I spent a lot of time covering the Soviet Union and Russia and read deeply into Andrei Sakharov's story and always wondered that question about him. And he was an insider, he was part of the Soviet elite. He realized what was happening. He became its sharpest critic. He inspired a generation of people. But what is that inside that little kernel of whatever it takes to do that? And I was sure that in Oswaldo's story, there would be an answer to that. And one of the answers was, when I finished the project, was to see that Oswaldo really was a product of the street, of inside of what was happening in Cuba. He wasn't somebody who was, created in Miami or Washington. He was very much a product of feelings and experiences that had happened to him during the revolution, from a Catholic family that had been marginalized, saw his father's small business confiscated, sent to Castro's forced labor camps. Mm-hmm. All these experiences sort of generated within his mind. I mean, he never, ever lived in a state of liberty, but it lived in his mind. And how that happens is what made him really unique. And the uniqueness was partially his trial and error method to figure out how to mobilize people for their rights. And part of it was this deep conviction he had, which grew out of his faith. But actually, it's sort of a political statement, which is that all of us are essentially bequeathed rights at birth, and we are not given our rights by the state. And this simple idea that we're born with rights and we should claim them drove him over so much hardship and difficulty. And a second idea, which I greatly admire, and it's the epigraph of the book, is this idea that he had that Cubans should be the protagonists of their own history and not the spectators. Mm-hmm. And so much about the revolution sort of put Cubans in as spectators. You know, the jury of the million, all those people raising their hands in the frenzy of Fidel's charisma, they were the spectators. And Oswaldo said, no, in a real society, we should turn it around and we should be the ones to decide where we're going and what we're doing. So one thing that made him uniquely threatening was that he did not want to relinquish to Fidel that role as the decider. He wanted to actually bring that power to people, to the street. And I tell the story in the book about the shaping and writing of the 1940 Constitution, which is really a very important moment in Cuba's history. And for reasons that are still a little mysterious to me, that provision in the 1940 Constitution that I describe about giving people a citizen petition, in other words, a right to decide their own future, to be the protagonists of change, was not only in that Constitution, but was left in the Basic Law of 1959 and was not cut out. Maybe Fidel thought nobody would ever bother to challenge him. Maybe he thought it was ridiculous, but it was left in there. And the Socialist Constitution of 1976, it was again left in there. So what made Oswaldo different is that many, many millions of Cubans understood that there was deprivation, there was shortage, that the revolution was a monopoly on power. People understood this, but Oswaldo acted on it. And he acted on it by deciding to take this small provision in the Constitution to give people power, the law of the state, and turn it against itself. And this is what I think frightened Fidel when Oswaldo got 35,000 people to sign their names and addresses and ID numbers and overcome their fears. It showed that he was beginning to enable people to grab the rights to become the protagonists of their own history.
You know, I was in Cuba with a group of students when President Jimmy Carter went to Cuba and presented the Varela Project in, I believe it was May of 2001 or June of 2001. And it was an amazing moment because he spoke live from the University of Havana. So the excitement that generated was unnerving, surely, to the state. It was really electric among the population. And I was witness to it for more than a year. It certainly came to a dead stop when the Cuban regime decided that they would effectively create their own referendum. And you discuss that in the book in order to discredit the voices of the people and those who had the courage to sign their names and addresses, as you say, to the petition. The petition for change in itself constituted a threat. The fact that Payá continued to struggle beyond
one page, one single page.
And yes, so one page was a threat, that he continued to struggle beyond the efforts of the state to silence even the possibility of its implementation. That's very clear from your book. Another thing that's very clear is that you demonstrate that the Cuban regime assassinated Oswaldo Payá in July of 2012. So I wonder why you think that it was so necessary now to revisit that assassination, to call it what it is. Why do you think Payá's story is so important right now?
I feel that I always had this idea that I mentioned before when I studied Sakharov. My previous book was about one man who took on the Soviet system by spying, but he really did it because he was fed up and he risked his life and gave his life for it. And when Oswaldo died in that car wreck, and it was not an accident, I call it a car wreck, for a reason. I actually had never met him. In fact, I've never met him, but I had known of him. I was the foreign editor of the Washington Post and had sent a reporter once to write a feature about Payá. So I always had it in the back of my mind that there was one guy in Cuba who was really going up against the system. So when he died, I made it my personal sort of crusade. I wrote a lot of editorials calling for an investigation, an international investigation, a credible one into his death, which we never got. I met his family, especially Rosa Maria and his widow, Ophelia. And over the years, I kept pushing them and asking them, I'd love to write a book about it. And it took them a while, I think, to think about it because it was a traumatic time. And 5 years later, they basically said yes. And I was thrilled. And I immediately began to work in August of 2017. And one of the things that I discovered was that there was a rich, incredibly inspiring story. And they had a lot of archives, which included Oswaldo's handwritten notes and handwritten manifestos. And boy, I was like just a historian's dream, because I felt the story was original, but was replicable and reusable history for my friends in Belarus who were beginning to think about how do we mobilize people, Burma, everywhere you look, what Oswaldo was doing, figuring out a way to mobilize people to be the protagonists of their own history is happening all over the world. And of course, it's now burst on the scene with Ukraine. It's happening obviously in Russia and China. This is the story of our age. So why now? Because here are lessons about how to do it that are vital for where we are.
I think that in my own personal observations of the last few years, especially in fact, as I've looked at the files of many people who have asked for political asylum in the United States, one of the legacies of Payá, whether the citizens of Cuba who act on that legacy know it or not, is precisely what you said at the beginning of our talk, which is that there is in his discourse, in his promise, in his manifesto, an assertion of the right to disagree and an assertion of the right to dissent and assertion of the right to determine one's destiny. And so you hear that all the time from very young Cubans who have tried to get out of Cuba or have gotten out of Cuba and have to explain what happened to them. And their problem, their political problem, is precisely that they believe that they can simply just not agree with the government and say it. And of course, you can't do that. You're supposed to agree.
Yeah. You're exactly right, Lynn. And remember July 11th of 2021 when all those protesters went on the street spontaneously because of that Facebook broadcast. And I was stunned to see many of them holding up their hands like this in the L for Liberación, which was Oswaldo's idea 20 years earlier. Many of them weren't even born. And even today, after all the repression and the way so many of them have been jailed, I still see random Cubans everywhere and holding up their hands for liberation. And I remember that Oswaldo wanted to call his movimiento just Liberación. He just wanted to call it Liberty, but others, they had a big debate and they came up with a bigger name. But the point is that he identified this central longing for liberty.
Mm-hmm. So you, long before you started writing about Cuba, were already an internationally renowned expert on the Soviet Union. Oh, yes. And on the Gorbachev years in particular. So I want to take us back to that moment because I think the 90s, the 80s were a period of just incredible tumultuous change in the Soviet bloc. At the time, what did you imagine would be Cuba's fate? And did you ever think that the communist state of Cuba would last as long as it has? Because we're going on 63 years now.
And as a historian, having walked again through the 63-year history, I'm amazed to this very day that it's still standing. But I did learn some lessons in that Soviet time that I think are applicable here. And one of the most important is that if you look at what happened in the Soviet system in that time, the system began to stagnate. Really, it was after the thaw and after the period of hope following Stalin's death. In the 60s, the Soviet system began to gradually wind down. Its vitality began to slip away. And the people who lived in it understood that. You know, my friends would say one day there was no cheese. And then the next day there weren't even any tomatoes. And then we found the day came when even a simple tea bag, and the Russians love their tea, was gone. And excuse me, this gradual slide into stagnation deeply disappointed many people. They had a lot of people who thought that the Soviet system was going to be a cradle to grave provider, a sort of utopia, began to see that it was full of empty rhetoric. They didn't pay attention anymore to the slogans that were plastered everywhere. Excuse me. So the stagnation eroded and corroded the system, and it began to weaken. Yet at the same time, they saw from elsewhere, Levi's, one pair of jeans became a desperately sought after item for young people. How to get them, you know, and can you imagine to us something very simple? I have Russian friends who told me how in that time period of growing shortages, let's say 89 and 90, they watched a famous American movie called Chinatown. And there's a scene in the movie where the lead actor opens the refrigerator, a scene that none of us would have paid any attention to. And my friends, their eyes just bugged out. The refrigerator was completely full. They'd never seen anything like it. That was a very important moment for them. I tell you all this because I think Cuba is in that period of Soviet stagnation and of weakening and corrosion of the system. People lose faith, they lose their fear. And that fear was essential to Fidel's method of holding it together. And I think this is 64 years. The Soviet system lasted about 70. We're in the Brezhnev period of Soviet system in Cuba. And everything I read, the shortages, the lack of fear, the loss of faith, makes me think the system's going to crumble.
You know, I was just thinking yesterday about a friend of mine who back in 1995, the first trip I made to Cuba, told me that when American films were shown in Cuba, that one of his jobs was to cut out any scenes that were in grocery stores or showed refrigerators.
That's amazing.
And their contents. That's amazing. Yeah. So maybe that's one of their secrets is, you know, certainly to control even the most minute forms of access to knowledge of what other societies are like. But certainly that's increasingly difficult to do in Cuba.
Impossible to do. Yeah. Miami's not far. The paquette comes every week. There's just so many ways.
Yes. So that then begs the question, how did Oswaldo Payá do it? How did he challenge totalitarianism at a time when not only was control over information just as ideal for the government as it is today, but also much easier to achieve simply because there were fewer means and mechanisms by which others could communicate with the outside world? So how did he achieve, you know, a network of supporters? How did he get people to sign this petition? What was the method?
Well, as you note, he didn't have an iPhone. He didn't have text messaging. He didn't have any of the things that we see today for communicating. And in fact, he had no access even to the methods that did exist. He couldn't be on the radio. He was banned from the newspapers and from television. Oswaldo's experience after he developed this idea that people should be the protagonist, he first tried to do it in the 80s through the Catholic Church. His family had worshiped at the same parish church for 4 generations. He had a priest there, Father Arturo Petit, who passed away not long ago. And when he was the parish priest, he told Oswaldo and the young people in that church, in their club that they had, that the church was a temple of freedom, that they could say anything they wanted inside that parish church, and they did. And this kernel again was planted in his mind. And when he became a young adult, he tried working with the Archbishop of Havana with Jaime Ortega, later Cardinal Ortega, to reinvigorate the church because it had fallen on hard times under Fidel. And that whole effort, which took a couple of years, at first excited Oswaldo. He was Ortega's assistant. He organized a lot of the effort to reinvigorate and rethink the church's role in totalitarianism. And ultimately, it was a failure because Oswaldo was not allowed to, in the final climactic conference, when they were rethinking the future of the church, he was not allowed to give a speech about freedom and liberty because Jaime Ortega felt that it would endanger him and the church and the whole adventure. And of course, Ortega was secretly working on rapprochement with Fidel himself. Again, I think to save the church, but at high cost to liberty. So bounced out of that in 1986, and having seen his effort to mobilize failed, Oswaldo looked to politics. But he didn't have the experience. He did not train. He had no guidebooks from the American democracy promotions or anything like that. He just tried to do it himself, and there was a lot of trial and error. For a while, he definitely had seized upon this provision in the Constitution and the idea of getting people to sign something to declare their intention to steer their own destiny. And at first, he passed out a handbill calling for signatures for a national dialogue. It was very fuzzy, Lillian. I don't think even he really understood, but he set up a small table in his house in Havana and opened the door and said, if you believe in this, come sign our petition. He had about 200 or 300 signatures in July of 1991 when, bam, acto de repudio, gangs attacked, overturned the table, a whole strike by the regime against it. But it was the time of the special period. People were hungry. People were thinking about how to take things. So he kept trying. He then tried something called the transition program, and it was a 46-page, single-spaced study of how do we get to democracy. And nobody paid any attention to it because it's too complicated. And he was very worried about what happened in Tiananmen in China in 1989. Bloodshed, he felt, was something that could happen in Cuba, and he did not want to be inspiring or mobilizing people toward riots. He was worried about that. He talked about it a lot. So he's still groping, looking for a way. And then he decides again to try for signatures, to try and use that provision of the Constitution against the state. And it's only in 1996 that he was sitting and thinking about why all his efforts had failed. Really, almost 8 or 9 years of trial and error had not succeeded. And he had kind of an epiphany. He decided that you've got to make it simple and very clear. And one day, sitting on the couch, he wrote 5 very simple demands for freedom: a free press, free speech, free enterprise, freedom for political prisoners, freedom to worship, freedom to choose our destiny. And this became the Varela Project. And it took off because it was simple. And how he did it was he went door to door. I mean, he did it with shoe leather. He had a full-time job in Havana. He was a technician for medical technology in hospitals. He did a lot of repairing hospital. On the weekends, he started a movimiento in 1988. He used that network of people in different towns to gradually go door to door. He would tell people, this is for real, this is serious, it's legal, it's in the Constitution, we're going to use the Constitution, sign here, put your name, stand up for what you believe in. It really began to expand by the thousands, but not by the tens of thousands. The other major event was Pope John Paul II's visit, and that visit in which he, in his final homily in the square, urged Cubans to become the protagonists of their own history, not spectators. When he used those words, Oswaldo was electrified. This is what he had been thinking and saying. And it spawned thousands of people to start to sign the Varela Project. Even though the Pope didn't actually appeal for the Varela project per se, what he said. And by 2002, Oswaldo submitted 11,020 signatures. He also had tens of thousands more who were signatures he was verifying, he was checking, because state security had tried to subvert the campaign. The nuns in Havana, one particular order of nuns, hid his signatures to keep them safe from state security. He then submitted 14,000 more in the following year, and he still had 10,000 more to come.
Wow. It's an extraordinary account. And I really want to thank you for making it possible for all of us to know about it, and to meditate on it, so that maybe from afar or from within, we can do what we can do to make Cuba a freer place. Thank you so much, David, for sharing this work with us, and for sharing your wonderful reading with us on Ex Libris. And I look forward to hearing more about your next project.
Yes, and I would urge everybody listening to read your new book, Patriots and Traitors, which is just another one of your deep dives into part of Cuba's history we need to know.
Thank you. Thank you so much.